Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Central European Talks. I am Srdja Pavlović, a research associate with the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta. This afternoon, I will talk to you about the most effective way of reading the stars in the Balkans. The talk examines media landscapes in Serbia in the last decades of the 20th century and looks for strategies employed by both the civilian and military structures of power in constructing enemies, both foreign and domestic. What we had in Serbia in the last century was, among other things, the application of occult, paranormal, and prophetic themes by both the state-controlled media and some that had championed the cause of the opposition political parties. During the 1990s in Serbia, public opinion polls had been used mostly, but not exclusively, to project the size of an electorate body and give a hint of the political preference of individual voters. The most intriguing, however, were the responses to the questions about individual beliefs in numerology, astrology, prophecies, and horoscopes. A number of surveys conducted in Serbia after the 1998 NATO bombing campaign showed that approximately 50% of those interviewed believed that events of cataclysmic proportions would take place in some of the NATO countries. Some 60% of those with elementary school education believed in the doomsday scenario and the suffering of NATO countries. Among university graduates, on the other hand, about 30% expressed their firm belief that some kind of punishment will be imposed upon NATO countries in the future, but by what or whose agency remained unclear. These surveys also suggested that believers and devoted practitioners of Eastern Orthodoxy had shown a greater inclination towards believing in supernatural phenomena than those who identified themselves as either agnostics or atheists. I hasten to add that turning towards superstition and horoscopes in time of hardship is neither specific to the South Slavs nor a characteristic solely of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The ruling elite in Serbia in the 1990s had played a pivotal role in nourishing such sentiments among its citizens. The market had been flooded with books on various formulas of lights, prophecies, horoscopes, numerology, and conspiracy theories. Various healers and prophets were constant features on almost every TV show. There were specialized magazines devoted to occultism and the paranormal, such as The Third Eye, Secrets, The Sixth Sense, Miracle, Twilight Zone, Nostradamus, Horoscope, and a number of others. The content was dominated by political themes. Some of the titles: The Programming of the Brain in American Schools, The Demonic Project of the American Government, The Era of Aquarius and the New World Order, or Americans admitted that their army is using black magic, as well as the US government sold its soul to aliens in order to become the only superpower and subdue other nations on the planet, and my absolute favorite, the Nemanjić dynasty and the Third World War. The magazine Horoscope repeatedly published profiles of prominent political figures such were Slobodan Milošević at the time, Dobrica Ćosić, the president, Vojislav Šešelj, and others, expressing, reinforcing, and canonizing a belief that the local power structure and its exponents are the true representatives of a Serb collective being. The Third Eye monthly was published by the government-controlled Borba Incorporated. In turn, Borba Incorporated was originally established and had been funded by the federal government of the former Yugoslavia. The magazine Horoscope, on the other hand, was published by Politika, the biggest daily in Serbia, yet another government-funded and controlled publishing corporation. At one point in early 1992, the Belgrade daily Politika and its subsidiary, TV Review, began publishing photographs of a local healer and prophet, claiming that he was able to project positive energy through his printed image to readers who managed to collect a sufficient number of his photos. Long before magazines such as the Twilight Zone came into existence, for example, that was 1995, the biggest Serbian daily, I just mentioned, Politica, introduced regular sessions on astrology and Chinese horoscope. In March of 1992, the science editor of Politica organized, and his newspaper sponsored, a unique event in Belgrade, the transfer of mental images from the Russian city of Novosibirsk to Belgrade. The same editor, in one of his articles, claimed to have discovered an unusual scientific study that successfully solved a number of cases of alien abduction. At the beginning of 1992, amid the constitutional, political, military, and economic crisis in what at the time still was the former Yugoslavia, Politica began publishing a series of articles about miracles of parapsychology in the former Soviet Union. So, while Slovenia was seceding from Yugoslavia and Croatia was bracing itself for war, and while the politics of nationalism and populism were on the rise in Serbia, readers of Politica were presented with details of paranormal occurrences in quote-unquote Mother Russia. For example, the author of that series of articles claimed that the former General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, had died of some sort of telepathic aggression rather than of cancer. There was also lengthy and detailed descriptions of the case of a flying woman from Moscow. Some years later, the editorial policy of Politica placed a bit less emphasis on paranormal activities involving individuals and devoted more space to various conspiracies by Western historians and philosophers, including yours truly. A common theme in those articles were secretive groups that control the planet and people who carry the quote-unquote sign of beast, as well as the magical significance of the numerical combination 666 that, according to the findings by Politica, could be detected in then the newly issued EU passport. Conspiracy theories do not necessarily fall into the category of superstition, but both spheres share certain common features. First, they both place an individual in the position of a helpless toy in the hands of mighty and invisible forces. Second, the content and framework of conspiracy theories have many elements of pseudo-rational forms of thinking, which in turn are the basis of superstition. So how are we to interpret the fact that the mainstream media in Serbia in the 1990s devoted so much time and space both to endorsing irrational modes of thinking and to actively encouraging them? It is, of course, tempting to generalize that such encouragement rested on the existing beliefs in superstition and the paranormal, and that the structures of power were just taking advantage of it. I would argue in favor of the process of rehabilitating the imaginary at the expense of the rational, and suggest that such state-sanctioned rehabilitation was the direct product of the economic, social, political, and cultural crisis in the country. Possible manipulating of a population was already displaying a considerable attachment to supernatural mode of thinking, seemed to be a rather pragmatic move on the part of the ruling elite. It was not based on coercion and did not provoke resistance. So it was and is relatively easy to fabricate a prophecy. One did not have to follow rules and regulations in Serbia at the time, nor were there any restrictions in that respect. The truthfulness of prophecies, or the perception of it, was almost never questioned. Its acceptance by the general public depended entirely on the popularity and the media profile of the prophet. So, visions of the future and prophecies were, of course, far removed from any factual base, and that characteristic might have been where their strength lied. The further removed a prophecy was from the social context, the more credible it became. Furthermore, a prophet was perceived as a medium that only conveyed a message initiated by an unknown source, cosmic or divine. The personal responsibility of the prophet was never an issue, therefore, since he or she was not perceived as the one who generated the message. If need be, the falsity of claims could have been easily explained by emphasizing the frailty and unreliability of human nature. One could compare the role played by modern-day prophets in Serbia to that of medieval sorcerers, and that is a comparison that has been often made. They were mediums through whom a higher power spoke, and the truthfulness of their words was never questioned. So those extraordinary personalities were thought to represent and through their message convey the purest expression of the spirit of Serbhood. The failure to predict the future correctly was seen either as the result of a loss of energy on the part of the prophet or as the product of some strange and unwanted, often psychic intervention by outside sources. Every once in a while, a new prophet would appear on TV and in newspapers, and I refer to those as substitute psychics. They were called upon only in the time of immediate crisis, and only when the existing psychic network proved to be grossly inaccurate in its predictions. Those replacements, however, had to strictly correspond to a particular set of expectations and had to conform to a clearly delineated field of action. Naturally, minor variations were acceptable, but in general, there could not have been any compromise in regards to their social status, their place of birth, and education as well as cultural background. They were representatives of common folk, usually older and predominantly male, peasants from the heartland of Serbia, whose education consisted of their life experience and whose cultural background was closely interwoven with traditional Serbian culture. In other words, they were representatives of that acclaimed Slavic soul, the people of simple means that were blessed with an uncommon gift. They were perceived as being spiritually strong and independent because they drew their energy from that deep well of the pure and generous tradition of the Serbian collective being and announced their vision in a traditional manner using the language of the common people. One such example was Grandfather Miloje, a prophet from the Morava Valley. Miloje's prophecies were published in Belgrade in 1993 in the form of a book, and the book became an instant bestseller despite persistent rumors that its content was entirely constructed by its editor and that a man by the name Miloje never really existed. So, Miloje predicted that Bill Clinton would die on May 19, 1996, and that former Russian President Boris Yeltsin would be defeated by Mikhail Gorbachev and would end up being assassinated. The fascination with an allegedly fabricated text and with its allegedly non-existent author only proved the effectiveness of the use of archetypes in manipulating the public perception of reality. The real purpose of introducing, or inventing, if you will, Grandfather Miloje seemed to have been the need to legitimize the present rather than to call upon the past in order to predict the future. Miloje's authority as a prophet was needed to ultimately shore up public support for Slobodan Milošević, since Miloje had made specific references to the former Serbian president and to his role in shaping the future of his people. Miloje told us that Milošević was, and I quote, the only one capable of battling the devil, and that he must not fall from power under any circumstances, end of quote. Prophets' voices brought the past alive, while their visions and fantasies offered reassurance to the population under duress. Their function was to displace an individual, at least temporarily, from the envelope of everyday life, and try and position an individual on the ethereal level of an aesthetic existence. Such visions and such fantasies made it less difficult for an individual to step out of one's own reality of daily life and cross the boundaries between two worlds, to inhabit that other reality even for a brief moment. The appeal of such a voyage is so strong that people live and relive those special moments, waiting for them to happen again. This is what constitutes the nostalgic feeling about the good old days. As a rule, prognosis for the future were bright and always invited support for the government in power. Every so often, readers were presented with an abbreviated version of the scenario for achieving the centuries-old political dream of Greater Serbia. Quote, astrologist Soka from Vukovar spoke yesterday. She said that the Republic of Srpska Krajina will cease to exist as an independent state because it will become a part of the Union of Serbian states whose capital will be in Ohrid. That big new state will be monarchy, and its monarch will come from the Nemanjić family. In the future, the world will call this war a world war, and Croats will be of Eastern Orthodox faith and will respect and celebrate, as the Serbs do, the family saint. End of quote. What is important to note here is both the timing of this revelation and its source. This vision of a future Serb state appeared in the Serbian press during the London Peace Conference between May and December 1992, at the time when the popular sentiment in Serbia was that of an approaching victory on the battlefield, as well as of an imminent and favorable political settlement. Even late Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia at the time, during his flight to London to attend the peace conference, remarked to his lieutenants that the Serbs, quote, are the winning party. So the astrologist was a woman from Vukovar, a Croatian town that was obliterated by Serb artillery and ethnically cleansed of its Croat population in 1992. There were also indications that those in power in Serbia were susceptible to supernatural beliefs. In the spring of 1999, some senior members of the Yugoslav left, a political party established in Belgrade by the wife of late Slobodan Milosevic, established something called the Yugoslav Committee for Coherence and Invincibility. The role of this committee allegedly was to work according to the instructions of Maharishi Mahesh on training some 1,000 or so yoga flyers to protect Yugoslavia with the power of their positive energy. Among the project's many institutional supporters were the Yugoslav Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Health. Journalists have alleged that in the early 1990s the Yugoslav army as well established a secretive organization called Group 69. And that was a group tasked with dealing with issues of psychological warfare and various paranormal activities. According to press reports, this group consisted of various specialists for parapsychological phenomena, a number of high-profile politicians, prophets, astrologists, intellectuals, opponents to the New World Order, and a number of army officers. According to one report, one of the members of Group 69 was the army colonel Svetozar Radišić, who was also the editor-in-chief of the Yugoslav army monthly called Vojno Delo, as well as the regular contributor to the monthly magazine The Third Eye. Further reports on the activities of this group appear on the pages of The Twilight Zone, where the author of the article admitted to cooperating with this group since 1993. According to him, Group 69 was formed as a section of the general headquarters of the Yugoslav army with the purpose of researching and eventually using new weapons for defending the country. He further stated that the group had sent positive signals to the outside world from the very beginning of the Yugoslav crisis and had announced its preferring peace to cooperation and cooperation to war. The author claimed that Group 69 successfully used a special procedure that he referred to as the Serbian mirror. Readers were given no details about the nature of the weapon itself, other than that it had been based upon the past inventions by the physicist and inventor Nikola Tesla. The practical results of the use of the Serbian mirror were such that, according to the news, some of the enemies had died. Turgut Özal, a politician, François Mitterrand, Yitzhak Rabin. Some lost members of their immediate family, so former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl lost his son. Czech President Václav Havel lost his wife, while others got away with minor injuries, so Bill Clinton only broke his leg. This trend continued more or less unchanged through the late 1990s, and the end of the millennium had served as a convenient context for venturing further into the unknown. Predictions that came after 2000 were intended to have a soothing effect upon the population. A certain grandmother, Vuka, predicted that Slobodan Milošević would stay in power, while Bill Clinton would, quote, fall as a rotten pear. And another prophet, Zorka, said that no one would be able to harm Milošević and that Kosovo, quote, will be ours again. The usage of prophecies and prophets as tools in gaining and strengthening political capital acquired new competitors during the presidential election campaign in the fall of 2000. The new player in this field of dreams and fantasies was the Serbian democratic opposition. In the midst of the presidential campaign, the presidential candidate for the opposition parties, Vojislav Koštunica, made a point of visiting the village of Kremna, the birthplace of the late Tarabić brothers, well-known Serbian prophets. Upon his arrival, Koštunica was greeted by Jovan Tarabić, a descendant of famous prophets, who addressed him in the following way, I quote, "Welcome, Mr. President. It was said that a man of the people would come and bring prosperity, and that he would save our people from misery." End of quote. When asked who that man might be, Jovan Tarabić replied, "Mr. Koštunica, of course." The author of this newspaper report described not only Koštunica's visit to the village, but gave a brief historical account of the entire region. While praising the natural beauty of Kremna, and it is a beautiful region indeed, the author repeatedly referred to it as the Serbian Delphi, and as a place where people live long and prosperous lives. He even managed somehow to incorporate into his narrative a part of the title of one of Milan Kundera's books. And I will read you a short paragraph from this description. Quote, "Fertile land. In the foothills of the mountain Tara, in a landscape so beautiful as if it has been created by a divine hand, lies hidden the village of Kremna, shielded by pine trees. From every rock, a mountain spring flows. People say that when the sun rises, it does so first over Kremna, and only then over the rest of the world. A snake-like dirt road leads to this Serbian Delphi, the homeland of Tarabićis. Even though it might not seem that way, there are no miracles here. Here, human spirit and nature have been establishing a relation of mutual respect for centuries and have acquired the fine balance of the lightness of being." End of quote. Koštunica's visit to Kremna was depicted as nothing short of a religious experience, and as an ultimate confirmation by the late prophet's descendants of Koštunica's worthiness to become the future president of Serbia. He traveled to Kremna to be embraced by a spiritual authority as the victor in the upcoming elections and as the savior of Serbia. Given these examples and the mounting evidence, one would wonder whether the population in Serbia had been the object of manipulation and mind games by the ruling elites at the time, or whether the representatives of the power structure believed in and were guided by the rules of the paranormal themselves. I would suggest the two options are not mutually exclusive but complement each other. In any society under duress, as we know from history, the feeling of isolation, either social or political, economic or cultural, of a group and its members, and the helplessness that often derives from such isolation, could create and condition a paranoid-like perception, not only one's own reality and immediate environment, but of the world as well. Through a complicated web of causalities, such perception could also gradually induce feelings of one's particular importance, grandeur, and generalist superiority in regards to others, as well as the belief that the group in question is the subject of others' hate, persecution, and conspiracy theories. The ruling elite of Serbia in the 1990s had claimed that the citizens were subject to various hostile outside interferences, as well as unprecedented stellar occurrences and the use of magical powers against them. So, in an unprecedented environment of isolation, paired with a series of lost military conflicts, it is not difficult to understand how a paranoid perception of the world could become the main feature of public discourse in Serbia in the late 1990s. Thank you.